important is to address what's happened over the past year. We've seen a lot of value, a huge growth in the community, and a lot of new interests. And it's kind of important to sort of step back and pause. What has been driving this? And I really think one of the major contributors to this has been the ERC20 standard. Show of hands who actually knows what ERC20 is. Okay, great, cool. For those who don't know, ERC20 is a token standard. It was created by just a few handful of people. And what's really powerful about this, together with programmable blockchains like Ethereum, is it's marginalized the costs of creating tokens and thereby digital assets. And what this has done is allowed any individual to create another asset and bring in their community and their pool, social network and people into this space. And as a result, we've seen a large influx of value moving into the space, but at the same time, it's kind of narrowed our view and kept it more like a sort of financial sort of perspective. But the reality is, what's actually happening right now is much broader in scope, and a lot more is actually happening. In fact, ERC20 didn't actually intend to drive billions of dollars of value into this space in the last year. It really was just serving a basic infrastructure need. And there's many more other standards that are coming up soon. One of my favorite ones at the moment is ERC 725. This is an identity standard. That'll probably mean that logging into a website will just completely disappear. It could even mean that if fully realized, redundant form filling on paper could also disappear. It could also mean that lines of immigration, for example, could get much shorter because things just take less time, and ultimately it could even be your passport. Now, this might not sound too interesting at first glance, but if you think about the hundreds of thousands of man-hours that are going to be saved collectively, that can be put to something else, it can become quite impactful. And these standards are literally just done by a few handful of people, but they can have such a profound impact over the way that we organize ourselves socially. So I tend to think a lot about, okay, so we're creating these standards at the moment. They're really only focusing on basic infrastructure, but what happens when we start to go beyond that? What happens when we start creating smart contracts that start to replace our laws, replace our policies? What does the world look like when just an individual, even a small child, has the power to write a smart contract that can fundamentally change the way we socially organize, deploy it globally in 15 seconds or less for anybody to use? What does that world look like, and how do we operate in it? You see, what's happening now is not unlike the discovery and founding of the United States, or any nation state for that matter. You see, our generation, we don't have the luxury of moving to a new land and experimenting socially. Sure, there's things like Liberland or seasteading, which are trying to make new spaces, but really, the best place for us to do this kind of experimentation is the digital landscape or the internet. And it's quite interesting because there's some loose parallels we can draw from how we as humans have entered a physical space and built our civilizations. So in the super early days, when computers weren't really networked, but they were still ubiquitous around the homes, we had to call up, like literally with our modems, and call another person's house to access the computer, and they'll be running a thing called a BBS, or a bulletin board system. You could leave a message there, hang up, and then someone else can come along. Or you'd be calling them directly and have a sort of network connection between two people. This is sort of pre-sort of dial-up age. And this is very similar to sort of like how humans will kind of nomadic tribes walking around, looking for social contact, looking for other humans. And you know, as soon as we start having consumer-grade sort of internet, and we could dial into our ISPs and connect to the web, which had just been invented, then we started to see something that looked a little more like feudal villages, and today more like kingdoms. Here we have the client-server model that's inherently baked into the web, and has a lot of parallels with these. For example, services offer their service for free with the cost of harvesting your data, selling you advertisements, and making you a better customer. Not because they're inherently evil, it's just the way these systems are designed, and it's a natural progression. And that's not really unlike a lot of sort of kingdomhoods or feudal villages, in the sense that they would offer a protection service, and then they would tax their peasants. So this is where things start to get really interesting, because with blockchains and Web 3.0, we can basically take the lawlessness of this internet landscape and we can overlay it with a thin layer of order. We no longer need, it's inherently peer-to-peer, and we no longer need the trusted intermediaries to do anything. So going back to this idea of creating smart contracts to do laws and policies, what happens when we start to disintermediate our institutions? What happens when we start to recreate the governing services that we need on top of the blockchain? Will these systems look like nation states? Will we become citizens of blockchains? I'm not too sure. But it is kind of an interesting thought process, and maybe they'll end up looking like virtual nation states or stateless nations. Now, this might sound really far-fetched to you, but if you look at how our apps are currently developing, our apps have monthly active users that are in comparison with our best nation states. Isn't it conceivable that an application that has unfettered access to a blockchain can service its citizens or its users in a way that's, okay, not physically, but economically and socially more prosperous, or at least as competitive? This idea of mass adoption is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And what I concern myself with is how we can take this alien kind of foreign blockchain and make it as usable for the average user. How can we onboard people en masse in a way that feels familiar, and they're almost unaware that they're using such an advanced technology. And that's what Status really is. It's a full light client, Ethereum node that you actually run on your device. We kind of imagine it being something like an operating system, but it has some core features. One is being the wallets to manage your assets and sign transactions, the sort of chats, which are kind of like tabs as well, because you can also access dApps. And with this, you can basically capture the conversation that comes around the meeting of our minds, and ultimately signing some kind of social contract or a smart contract in our case. So, how we do this, we accomplish it using Web3. As you already know, that Ethereum is a blockchain. I think we're all kind of familiar with this. We use a protocol called the Light Client protocol, which allows us to have the same decentralized securities, but without having to download the entire blockchain stake. As you can imagine, it's quite taxing on a phone. But there's two other protocols that are in the Ethereum web stack, which some people aren't really aware of. One of those is called Whisper, and it's a decentralized messaging service that offers some fantastic privacy features that you just don't see in instant messages today. And the other one is called Swarm, which is a decentralized file storage. Another product along that same line is called RPFS, and both very interesting. But the purpose of building on top of these technologies is because as soon as you create any sort of centralization between the client and the application, you lose some really interesting properties. Basically, you revert to this sort of feudal kingdom sort of architecture, back to the sort of client-server model. And we're really trying to stay away from that, because if we do, then we as the creators can actually give ownership and governance over to the very users that are using the platform. And that's something that's been unprecedented in applications today. So how Whisper works is essentially you have a peer-to-peer network. When you send a message out, it'll actually bounce around the network. It's basically a butterfly. It goes around from person to person, and they continue to relay it. At the same time, everyone's basically got a net, and they're catching these little butterflies, and they're pulling them out, and then trying to, I don't know, look at them and open them up. And if they can't open them up, then they just kind of release them, and it continues to fly. Eventually, the butterfly goes along, and it dies. It may or may not even reach this destination. So that's what that's what's actually happening in Whisper, more or less. While that's also happening, everyone else is also throwing up more butterflies as sort of smokescreen. So you essentially get this network of information that's kind of very resistant to sort of dragnet surveillance. It's very difficult to really see who is sending what message and where it's actually coming from. But I mean, this does introduce some really interesting problems. For example, if a recipient is offline, then this butterfly is just going to keep going out there and just going to keep on dying, which is quite terrible. And obviously, you can't have a really good conversation that way. So, how do we resolve this? Yeah, so we resolve this by using basically other nodes in the network called status nodes. These act as what we call offline inboxes. Basically, they just capture these butterflies and they can hold on to them for you. But they can also read other messages and communicate with external services. So things like push notifications. When you're on any kind of instant message today, if you've got your phone in your pocket or in your purse, you feel it vibrate, that's a push notification, and this is how we achieve that. And then if the sender goes offline and the recipient comes online, they can basically resync with this particular node, and for both the sender and the recipient, there's basically no skipping of a beat. They can rebuild the chat history. They can send messages to and from each other, and it behaves just like a normal user experience that you would expect. So another problem that we've been facing is the idea of content discovery. In the sort of Web 2.0 world, we have Google, and you can search through that quite easily. But it's inherently centralized, and it's fine, but it's very difficult to do in a decentralized way. So what we actually do is we have basically a gossip protocol, where essentially content is disseminated to your friends, and then friends of friends, and so on. For example, if you have a hashtag or you have offering a service to sell like coffee beans, you'll create this status and then you'll send it to your nearest friends. While that happens, they are also collecting their messages from their own friends, and they're basically all caching them. And then on a periodic basis, they take the top sort of 20% of the content that they see, and they share that with everybody else. So when we do this, we also sign every time that there's content that's kind of jumping ship. And this allows us to build what we call chains of trust. This becomes very interesting for moderation and then finding out what kind of content, or who's providing you content that you're actually interested in. And this allows us to build a very sort of base layer of reputation that'll, so you can basically change the network topology so you're receiving information that you actually care about faster, while at the same time kind of excluding things that maybe you aren't interested in, whether they're nefarious or not what your social circle is very particularly interested in. So I mean, that's more or less it from me. I guess the main purpose of this talk is not really to talk about status so much, but more to talk about the sort of broadening of horizons, stepping back a little bit away from sort of the finance sort of side, and thinking about where we are going in the future. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you very much.